Today I'll share with you the top 10 Scandinavian games of Sergei Tivyakov. Tivyakov being one of the leading experts of the Scandinavian defense with black. And the way that he likes to play this opening is rather than playing moves like Queen A5 or Queen D8, he likes to play the more modern interpretation of Queen to D6, just keeping the Queen a little bit more flexibly placed. And in the games, we're going to see a bunch of different options, but most of these games are going to see the move c6 being played, and this is a move that just has a very solid reputation, where, for example, if white were to just develop without really thinking too much about the position, well, we see that with natural moves, black does just get a very healthy position. For example, something like castles and, say, knight bd7, bishop e7, castles. Yeah, this is just ultimately going to be absolutely fine for black, where there aren't really any bad pieces in the black position, and it's kind of hard for white to really use their space advantage. Now, Tibia-Cobb's opponents obviously, are masters and mostly actually strong grandmasters, as we will see. So we're going to see them, make a bit more of an effort to try to disrupt black's normal setup. And, definitely going to have a lot of fun seeing how Tibia-Cobb has managed to continue playing the Scandinavian successfully, even today, as the chess world has, let's say, evolved from from the old school days. But still, he's been able to play an old school approach like this and make it work even against quite strong players. So yeah, basically what I'll do is I'll just start with kind of the main lines and sort of work my way back to, the games of Tibia Cobbs that do feature a bit more sidelines. Also worth pointing out that these ideas I'll show I do cover a bit more deeply in my course Play the Strongest Scandinavian in 2025, so do make sure to check out the link in the description in case that interests you. But this video itself will give you a pretty good start of how to play these positions with c6, especially in some of the more critical lines that white can play. So with the move knight d7, we are putting some pressure on the knight and leaving white with the question of how they're going to deal with it. Now, the move that Tiviakov's opponents played the most was the move of knight c4, and that is the move that we'll begin with. I will touch on small terms like f4 and bishop f4 a little bit later as well, so do stay tuned for that. But after knight c4, queen c7, oops, I accidentally clicked the wrong one there, but after queen to c7, basically, even though white does get a lead in development, it turns out that the black position is actually rather solid in this case, and it's not the easiest task for white to prove a clear opening advantage. Now, more often, Tivikov actually played the move of queen to d7, which might seem a little bit weird to block in the bishop, but it does open up some other ideas as well of bringing the queen around. The move queen d8 was also played in another nice game of Tivikov, so we will get to a bit later, but for now, we'll focus on the move queen d7, because there were two quite nice games that Tivikov played from this position I want to share. The first one was a game actually against the Indian Grandmaster and a top theoretician, Ganguly, in the FIDE World Cup Candyman Siesk in 2007. So yeah, in that game, white played the move bishop e5. As I point out in my course, the best option for white might actually be just to take on b6 and kind of play for, a bit more of an initiative in the center, but in the game, white played the move bishop to e5. And here's a question for you. What do you think is the move that black should play in this position here? And if you're enjoying the video so far, do make sure to smash that like button. And especially if you're new to the channel, you can also subscribe for more videos like this one. So at this point, there's a few moves black can play. For example, I think the move that I like the best is actually Queen f5, because a principle in the Scandinavian I've also mentioned in some of my other YouTube videos recently is that the exchange of minor pieces is generally an exchange of pieces in general. It's generally going to benefit black due to white having more space, so trading off the pieces does kind of neutralize it. But you don't want to play knight c4 because that's just going to help white develop for free, so you don't really want to lose the initiative like this. But queen f5, does allow you to recapture and activate a piece. And for example, if they played a move like queen at g3, you could play moves like queen g6 and just continue annoying their queen, just so it's kind of hard for white to really get a durable initiative. And, c2 is also coming under fire, so it's not that easy for white to really demonstrate an advantage here. Queen d1 also allows moves like knight e4 just to trade off the knights and just get good play like this. So it's probably the way that Tivyakov should have played it. But the move in the game of queen g4 is also possible. I do think it's a little bit less precise because white could have played the move queen e3, and then you don't have the move knight g4 like you would have with the queen on f5, which is why I do think this is a little bit less precise. But in the game, we do kind of get to see how a typical endgame plays out. Knight g4 also possible, of course, but in the game, we had bishop g4, and just so the video won't be too long because there are 10 games to go through, I'm just going to kind of quickly just play through the moves. Like, I'm not going to give too many comments, but I just want to show a little bit of an idea of how the sort of end game plays out and how the middle games play out. And you can see again knight g4 that we just want to exchange off the minor pieces. And d5, yeah, maybe just overextending a little bit too hard. Like, obviously, they were a bit nervous about their bishop getting stuck with f6, but the problem is in this arising position that black basically just has the bishop pair advantage, and, in case of g6, well, the pawn would be a bit overextended. Now, the game ultimately played out a little bit differently, where, black, I think, is still doing fairly well in this position. I mean, bishop e2 probably not the most precise compared to, developing the piece a little bit more directly, as it were, but here, once black played bishop f5, which is a very nice move to attack the weaknesses, we could kind of see the white's pawn's just a little bit overextended here, and in the subsequent play. Actually, the move rook c1 would have been, c4 would have actually been very strong, as it turns out, where you can just kind of maneuver the rook and just win a pawn. So the rest game maybe not as instructive as some of these earlier moments, but black did go on to win from this point, despite missing this rook c4 opportunity right here. So that's the first game I wanted to share, Ganguly against Tibiakov. And much like in my actual course, I'm not necessarily going to cover every single move of every game, but just kind of picking out the most salient moments. And if the game is really instructive to the very end, I will show it to the end. But I also want to share a game between Zumayev against Tibiakov from the Far Open of 2011. And in that game, White actually played a bit of a creative move of h3, actually sacrificing the pawn on d4. But it turns out that even though white does get compensation here, the black position is reasonably solid, and there are a few ways to play it. In the game, Tibiakov played e6, which to modern human eyes might, or modern computer eyes may look a little bit passive. I do think that, the move of e5 and sort of playing a bit more actively probably would have been the way to, also could have been a way for black to play that, modern, engines kind of tend to prefer this sort of thing. That being said, white does still have a pretty strong initiative after queen g3. So yeah, this is actually not such a bad pawn sack from white's point of view. Just, leave the black king stuck in the center. So okay, black end up playing e6. I will also mention a move of bishop to gf5 is also a possible alternative to explore, but in the game, e6 was played, rook d1, queen b6. All this is fairly normal, you could say. White does have to figure out a way to get at the king, and I think that the move in the game, knight e4, is certainly a reasonable start. A move like bishop e5 also was another way to exert some pressure, but in the game after knight e4, what we kind of see is that even though the black piece are quite stuck, objectively white should have some advantage. Still white has to kind of figure out the way to sort of attack, and in the game white kind of sort of missed his chance a little bit. Like queen g4 was probably not such a great move, and instead white probably should go for a move like h4, and I think that would have given white a very, very strong attack, actually. I do think white has a big advantage here, which is why I kind of mentioned a couple of alternatives to explore in your own time. But after queen g4, yeah, black was sort of able to stabilize a little bit, and, after just a couple of little mistakes by white, black was able to eventually get to a position where, white still has compensation for the pawn, but where black is kind of doing okay. And, rook d7 as well, also a bit of a concession, just helping black to develop. And after some more moves kind of around this point, it kind of becomes apparent that, black basically is actually going to be a little bit better. And after the move bishop f6, so clearly queen d6 repeats moves, but what if I mention that we actually have a better move in this position? Which, by the way, Tibiakov did find in the game. So you can put the move in the comments below if you think you found it, but the answer is that we now have this move of bishop to h6. And that just kind of, deflects their queen away, so that if they play like queen e5, we can go queen d2 and get the piece in this way. But if queen f3, then yeah, still queen d2 is going to be quite annoying. And queen f3 is probably not the best move, by the way. But yeah, at this point, black was able to kind of either get the queens off, or, in the case of queen c3, black is basically just up a pawn with a very good position. And even though rook c8 isn't absolutely the most precise, black kind of found the second chance to get in this c5 trick, realizing that after bc5 and king h7 that we are going to get back that pawn on f5 and just have the much better pawn structure. And in the end, White's move of rook e6, was a good swindling try, but if Black had found the move of c4 here just to kind of shut in the b3 bishop for the rest of the game, it just becomes a pretty much unplayable position because White effectively is playing without their bishop on a2 for the rest of the game. But yeah, that was the second game I wanted to share, this one between Zhumaev against Tivyakov. And with that, we can now move on to some other games that Tivyakov played. This is going to be a little bit of a long video. My throat was quite sore yesterday and this morning, but I gave it a bit of a rest so I can get back to a bit of a longer video after all. I do think that the move of Queen d8 is actually a move that I think is the best one for Black. I think this is the one that does allow Black to more or less equalize. So theoretically speaking, that would be my tip, and this is why I recommend in my Play the Strongest Scandinavian 2025 course. But I'll show a little bit how this game between Pro Tour against Tivyakov played in the Canadian Open 2014. Because I think that the move of Bishop G4 wasn't really the most precise. Because I think that the Queen is just very well placed on G3, and I think that you'd much rather keep the Queen on F3 so that if they castle, you've got this Bishop G4 trick still. And also, if they do play Knight B6, you just kind of get this very nice development. Again, castling Bishop G4 is a kind of trick you might get quite a bit in Blitz, but otherwise it's not so easy to comfortably defend the pawn on B2 as it happens. Meaning that after Bishop E6, White would probably play a move such as Knight to E3 instead. But in that case, I think G6 is going to be quite okay for Black. Like after Bishop E2, Bishop G7. Actually, you can also play Knight D7. Like that's also a very interesting move. In fact, just going for the bishop and so just going for this kind of setup. I mean, it's just going to be very flexible. Like I don't think Black really has any massive problems in a position like this. You can just kind of simplify the position accordingly. You can also just trade pieces here if you're so inclined. And I mean that's also going to ultimately be quite reasonable for Black at the end of the day. Now the actual game is still kind of instructive, and it does still show how a typical kind of middle game plays out. But I do think that objectively, White, does have a pretty big advantage here, and White won more because he was, 300 points higher rated than the opponent than necessarily because of the opening. So yeah, like I said, should probably go Bishop E6 instead if you want to play this as Black. Now to show you a few other ways White can play it, I remember actually there was also a game that Caruana played against Carlsen where he played this interesting move of A4, and that is actually quite a good option for White. They do cover in the Play the Strongest Scandinavian in 2025 course, but first let's focus more on Tivyakov's games in this training. So I will say the move of F4 I think is quite a strong weapon for White, and this is kind of one of the reasons why in the course I do show a lot of different ways to play Queen D6, because Queen D6 really doesn't have the best theoretical reputation, but it is a system that can be quite tricky if White is not so well prepared for it as Tivyakov's games kind of demonstrated. Now, theoretically speaking, the best option for Black might just be to play G6 and go for some setup like this, just trying to defend solidly. Even though I do think White has a pretty significant advantage here as well, because F4. I remember actually I discovered this move back in 2011. I guess I saw this Shirov Tivyakov game where Shirov kind of won quite a nice game against Tivyakov. I think it was with G6 and G4 was the way Shirov played it if I remember it correctly, but Bishop C4 kind of a better approach that the engines recommend. Um, but yeah, I prepared it for I think a first Saturday tournament in 2011 where I was playing for my first GM norm and kind of getting a win against this Queen E6 kind of, even with this is I prepared. Did go a long way towards me getting my first norm, but yeah, it's something that probably most opponents are not going to be so familiar with. It's a bit more of an advanced kind of line. And in this game between Wan Yongyo against Sergei Tivyakov from Moscow 2011, this knight b6 g4, I mean, from the opening perspective, yeah, White did get a big advantage out of the opening. This is true. But the fact that White was kind of on their own resources meant they kind of struggled to find the right way to follow up. I think that, probably White should have just gone castles a4 and, then White just would have had quite a big advantage in a position like this. But instead, White played a little bit too forcingly with g takes f3, with g8-5, I should say, which went after knight c3 takes, and now the move knight d7 that, suddenly white structure was a bit overextended and actually black was doing fine here. Queen f3 might have been a better attempt for white to try to set some problems, though I still think black is ultimately going to be doing quite fine here anyway, just using white overextension against them in a position like this one as such. But after castles, yeah, black end up playing this h6 move, just trying to sort of weaken the structure. I do think, theoretically speaking, that, yeah, probably takes here might have been a more reliable approach, but in the game, what didn't really deal with it with the best way, like, rather than playing queen f3 and keeping that attack on the f file, they played this somewhat permissive queen e2, which just meant that after the exchanges, and fe g5 is also a big mistake, by the way, that now knight e5, and point-wise, if they take, then this fork is just really annoying, but if they play bishop f4, as in the game, well, here as well, like, white structure is just a real mess, and, black just did a good job at keeping the control, like, queen a3 was quite a nice move, in which you're just able to grab this pawn with queen c3, be a pawn up, and eventually win from this point after some further adventures. So yeah, that was the game between Pro 2, between Wang Yungo against Sergey Tivyakov. That is our fourth game that I'm showing here. Let's now move on to a few others, like what happens if they play the move bishop f4. Now, bishop f4 actually was kind of the old main line of this queen d6 Scandinavian back in the early 2000s, but Tivyakov kind of showed in a couple of games, including a very nice one against Vishy Anand in Tata Steel 2006, which was kind of one of the games that really put this queen d6 Scandinavian on the map as a serious weapon. That was where Tivyakov kind of showed that black is fine if they do find the right move. So what would be the key move for black here in this position? Well done if you realize that the move here is to play knight to d5. That deals with the threat of knight g6, and it also helps us to exchange off the minor pieces so that we just get that active, the active play and negate the strength for white space advantage. It turns out you don't have to fear a move such as bishop c4 because you can actually just play queen e4, and this fork is actually quite a big problem as it turns out for white. So that's a little bit of a trap there that can catch someone out in blitz. White's best move here is probably actually to play a move like knight f3, which actually was played in a game between Palagras against Tivyakov in the Bundesliga 2008. So I'll just show you how that played out, where black played a solid enough move of knight b6. Computer kind of shows off and points out that the move e5 is actually a very interesting pawn sack, where you kind of sacrifice a pawn. But you sort of use white's difficulties developing their pieces to say that you do have quite good compensation. So just showing a little bit of a teaser from the course right here. But in the game, black played the move of knight b6, which even though it does give white a small advantage, it's not that bad for white either. And at this point, white probably, in hindsight, should have played a move like bishop g3, and only then played a move like castles, and that probably would have allowed white to, enjoy a very small advantage in a position like this, where they can try to, kick away the black pieces and have a little bit of an initiative to work with still. Even though probably the positions are not all that terrible if you do just stop that with a5, but white does have a little something to work with. But instead, white played the move of castling, which ends up being actually quite a mistake in this position, and it's a bit of a theme we can kind of see across these games that even featuring grandmasters, that even against a grandmaster, if you kind of get them on their own and get them thinking relatively early in the game, they are going to start making some small mistakes in like the first five or so moves of leaving their opening book. And that's where sort of the practical weapony sort of surprise weapons comes in handy. Because here black had a very good move, and well done in advance if you already found it. So it turns out that with the move queen e4, we actually are going to win a pawn here. And after bishop c7, queen c2, well, black is up a pawn in this position, and white is struggling a little bit. Maybe I would have played the move a b6, even though after d5 it probably is just going to transpose into the game anyway, which saw, this move order. So at d5, white's at least trying to get some compensation and get some counterplay before black is able to consolidate the king position. But the move of g6 is just a good reply, where what Tivyakov did is they just end up giving back the pawn here. Like bishop g7 is actually a really good move. Realizing that you don't really care too much if they take all these pawns, just in the rising position. A, their b2 pawn is quite weak, and B, we do have the bishop pair advantage. So it's going to be quite nice for us, and I'll show you the rest of the game just because it was Not an especially long one, but with the move of bishop c4, this just end up being a little bit of a blunder compared to a more solid move like rook b4 to kind of prepare bishop c4. The problem with the immediate bishop c4 is that now the move of rook a4 is a very, very annoying pin. Clearly, white was pinning his hopes on the move of b3 and kicking the rook away. Unfortunately for him, after rook takes c4 and rook d8, white just ends up losing two minor pieces for a rook. And with that, the game is basically over. After c5, obviously you don't want to run into rook d4, rook b8. That would be a little bit embarrassing, but after the move bishop d4 instead, it just all comes together. Like white's not really able to, push the c pawn to create swinging chances, and at the end of the day, the bishop just kind of raked the board. The game concluded with black just making sure the pieces are all covered, and from this point, white just resigned because he's down material for nothing, as it were. So very, very nice win by Tibiakov, just showing very well what black is trying to do in these sorts of positions. Also, I want to share the Anand Tibiakov game. I did say I would get to that one from the Vaikante tournament of 2006, where Anand played a move bishop e2, and this time Anand was rated like 297, 2 FIDE. This wasn't the time when he was, technically the world champion. That was from 2008, as it were. But it was sort of a time where it's kind of apparent that Anand was like one of the top two players in the world. And even so, the surprise of this system kind of got to him a little bit because in this position, black is actually a little bit better. White's not really getting absolutely full compensation for the pawn. Well, actually, to be fair, if they play queen e2 and go for d5, they actually do probably have decent compensation. But it's definitely not going to be a worse position for black. Like you have this idea of bishop g4 to try and trade off their attacking piece in this way, and if they play a3, you can then sort of kick away their bishop without losing the queen. That's kind of the somewhat computerish idea of h5 that does give black a fine position and a bit of a bit of a creative position, let's say. Something like this being kind of unclear, but ultimately okay for black. But after d5, black was actually doing very well after this next move, which it was very clear that Anand had missed in the game. You can always put in the comments below to see if you can find the move that Tibiakov played and that Anand also missed. So well done if you realize that instead of a move like cd5 or a passive move like bishop d7, we have the very nice trick of bishop g4, realizing that if they take the bishop, we do have the queen e4 move to rather embarrass white in this way. So in the game, white ends up playing dc6, and after bc6, still the same trick is in the air. Now, of course, Anand doesn't get to, being rated to 800 plus without, learning how to play, difficult positions well as good positions well. I can understand why black didn't play queen c2 because it does leave the king a bit exposed in the game. Black instead played rook d8, and, from this point, black's best move probably is to play a move like h5 and, sort of say that the king is going to be, reasonably safe on a square like, say, e8, just going back again. Also he can play stuff like king, queen g5 and, trade off the queen to sort of neutralize the white attack and keep an edge in that way. In the game, Tibiakov, played the move queen e6, maybe underestimating this castle's trick, realizing that you can't take the bishop because of this. And in the rising play, like white did sort of end up getting decent compensation. Rook a6 is quite a nice move to lift the rooking attack. Like it was a game that, even though it ended in a draw, it was kind of clear that black was always the one who was pressing with the extra pawn. But Anand also just kind of defended it reasonably well, like there weren't really any points where... And also kind of allowing rook e5 as well, where it slipped away, where white got back the pawn. And now, I mean, it's even white who's kind of better, but in the end, black was sort of able to, hold this marginally worse position and still make a draw. Like one of the results you have is either to play c4 like in the game, or to just trade the queens at some moment, and yeah, white is not really able to use their queenside majority to get any real chances. But yeah, if black had played a move such as f5 and threatened to f4 and just used the weakness of white's king, then black does actually have some quite decent winning chances with the extra pawn here. But say Levy, so that explains a little bit how the position plays out after, and I'll play the moves in the beginning again just so you can kind of follow along. But it does show how to play the position arising after c6, 95, 97, and this was something I was originally going to cover, like, just for the students of my Play Strong Scandinavian in 2025 course. I've decided to share it also on YouTube as a bonus, just because, Well, first of all, the game's very instructive, and I do like to share a nice little story as well of like how Tiviakov kind of made this weapon work for the last 20 years in his games. And the games themselves are also just very instructive, I think, worth just sharing with the world. Actually, something I maybe should have shared at the start of the video is actually how Tiviakov kind of started playing this Queen D6 Scandinavian to begin with. Because what happened was he actually played against it in a game in the Spanish League of 2005. But his opponent his opponent played a move of A6 like it was some Spanish IM. I kind of forgot the name, but Tiviakov kind of told this story in a Secrets of Opening Surprise book of New in Chess about 20 years ago. And so Tiviakov kind of played this up and he just sort of played like normal moves, but what he kind of realized is that it's actually very hard for white to comfortably defend the d4 pawn. And in that game after bishop f4, queen b4, like it was already quite hard for white to, simply avoid losing the pawn. And what kind of happened in the end was that Tiviakov kind of like offered a draw about like 12 or 13 moves in and a pawn down position. Sort of saying, well, you're got a better position, but I have the higher rating. And his opponent took the draw, and like that was sort of how Tiviakov started to play this system in his own games. I mean, he sort of played a bit of a different version we saw with C6, but that was sort of a good example of how he kind of used, a game from his opponent or an idea from his opponent to ultimately find one of his very best opening weapons and most successful opening weapons for the last 20 years. Now, we will get to A6. There was a game Tiviakov did play with this in 2006, but we will get to in due course. But first, I do want to just show a quick example of what to do if they play the move G3, because there was this game played between Masieja against Tiviakov in the Remco Haidt Rolf-Vega tournament of 2008. And I do think that G6 is actually a pretty decent alternative to knight e5. Like, I do think with best play that white, does get a little bit of an advantage in this position. But I also think the position is fairly reliable for black. There are a lot of different ways that you can kind of play it, a lot of different move orders. It's kind of interesting to see that the modern computer actually, kind of is drawn to the idea of playing a move like Queen C7, just with the idea of sort of neutralizing Bishop F4, because again, the exchange of the minor piece is just going to be quite nice when we're facing the opponent's extra space. So that's quite a decent alternative, just going for a bit more of an aggressive and an active setup by comparison. But in a game against Masieja, Tiviakov did play the normal Bishop E7. White played the move Bishop D F4, gaining a tempo on the Queen. Like I said, if you want to avoid that, play Queen C7 instead. But as it happened, once again, Tiviakov, decided not to go for the Bishop F3 and this kind of approach, which he ended up doing in a similar position in another game that we'll get to a bit later on. In that game, Peter A played the move A6, but the reason he didn't play it here is because this move of Knight B5 is a very nasty trick and something you do have to watch out for. So that explains why I played Bishop H5. And you may recall I mentioned before in the video I did on sort of the 10 big Scandinavian mistakes to avoid. I did point out in general you don't want your bishop to sort of get chased around and sort of targeted like this. That being said, we do have the move of Knight D7 where we are able to trade off the knight, and White probably does have a small advantage here with the bishop pair and with the space, but I also think that, Black does have a very solid position, and I think that, against players up to about a 2-600 level, you can probably get away with this. Well, I mean, Tiviakov certainly was playing this system a lot against Grandmasters, and still kind of outplaying his opponents in the middle game, even if he didn't always equalize out the opening. I think in the game, his move at 97 is where the game maybe loses a little bit of its relevance, because I do think that White it does have quite a big advantage. Like, there's just no real need to let white, get in this knight c5, and it was just kind of a bit rough for black from this point. So that's why I'm not gonna show it through the rest of the game. I think it's not the most relevant per se. But I do want to show this Almodiaki against Tiviakov game from the Amsterdam Open of 2006. I already touched on a move of knight c6, and by the way, I do go a lot deeper into this a6 move as well in my Play the Strongest Scandinavian in 2025 course. But basically, in the game, black played c6, and there's this kind of way just kind of avoid Fury and just try to get a position to play. That being said, theoretically speaking, this is a very good position for white, where if they do play the right moves from here, white is going to have a very big advantage, kind of like we saw with the earlier game before against what was his name? Um, I know we saw in one of the earlier games, against Samayev, that was the one. But yeah, after rook a b d1, queen b6, white does still have to be a little bit precise, where probably the move that white should play is something such as either move like rook e1 and, going for g4. I think if you find this sort of attack idea at g4 and this sort of thing, I do believe that that is going to give white a pretty serious advantage, where it is going to be, a little bit difficult for black to kind of defend his weaknesses. That's sort of technically kind of the problem with this approach, and sort of why I don't really recommend a6 in my course except as a surprise weapon per se. Well, also the move of h3 is a bit annoying, but again, I cover that in my course. But yeah, in the game, white sort of misplayed a little bit. Knight a4 maybe isn't all that bad, but just kind of a series of inaccurate moves by white, especially this move of c4 instead of an approach like, say, g4, like we kind of saw before. You're kind of failing to see this g4 idea, so it meant that black was basically just doing quite fine. And then when white did play the move g4, it was just kind of a little bit too late, where now black is just going to be quite solid. After rook c8, the move h4 is just, not having the same sting to it anymore as compared to some of the other lines. After queen e3, black played the move rook a8 to avoid the move queen a7. I do think you also could have just ignored it and just played a move like bishop b4 and, just caught up in development instead. Also, a move like b5, also kind of an interesting alternative, playing a little more dynamically and, preparing the bishop c5, as it were. But in the game, rook a8 was played. We had queen g3. Again, white should probably play rook d3 if they do want to try and ask black some questions. But in the game, after queen g3, maybe black should just have stopped the move bishop e7. But I'll show the game to the end anyway, just because it doesn't go that much longer. Also, once again, you can kind of see where feature of these positions are, like, even for grandmasters, it's not so easy to find the best moves for white in the Scandinavian, because the positions can be a little bit non-standard compared to some other ones. So, I mean, I didn't find this move of h4, to, kind of played in a better version, where black won't be able to so easily keep the king safe when, when castling's kind of ruled out as an option, with the pawn being moved in front of the king. Compare this with this position, well, now black is just doing quite well after knight c6. And white's move at knight b6 was kind of a little bit of an overstretch, where after rook e8, these pieces are just now very offside. And keep in mind that black is still a pawn up. After f4, this was kind of the final mistake. There's a lot of moves black can play, like the computer points out this sort of computerish move of playing e5 and knight e6 and just sort of winning like a lot of the white pieces at once from there. But in the game after knight c4, this also, was doing the trick, just kind of, giving up a piece temporarily, but making it where white just can't really save their pieces in the long term. Rook d8 also a very nice remove, realizing that white just is not going to be able to save the pieces, and with black being up two pawns and the knight basically being trapped as well, white didn't resign in this position. So yeah, having looked at this game, Almodyaki against Tivyakov, we now have just two games that I want to show you to conclude. This penultimate game was played between Kamsky and Tivyakov. This was played in round 13 of Vikonsay 2006. And he played this move a6. The move knight c6 is also a decent alternative I do touch on in the course as well, but the move a6 was played in the game. We had the move knight f3, and I know I probably would play the move b5 if I was black, like that's why I end up recommending in the course, but the move bishop g4 is also a possible alternative, although I do think if you want to play that way, maybe I would have considered maybe starting with knight c6. Although, to be fair, it probably doesn't make that big a difference. Like, it still can potentially transpose anyway after a later knight c6. But yeah, theoretically, b5 is what I'd probably recommend. One thing about bishop g4 is it does at least make the position a bit less theoretical, but yeah, I think that letting white get in g4 and knight g5 wasn't really ideal, and I probably would just play something like takes and queen c6, even though it's not really what you want to do when when you play this. And again, that's why I think b5 is better. But yeah, the game, like 95 is sort of though a mistake. Like at this point, white, I should have probably played a move of queen e2 and just kind of gone for h4, h5, and that would have been the way for white to demonstrate an advantage. Like, it's a bit of a computerish position, but it's one where, white is actually doing very, very well with this sort of initiative. But after knight e5, it turns out that this knight c6 is a really good extra option. And by the way, this is the reason why knight c5 works a lot better after c6, because you don't have knight c6 to get rid of their knight in an active way. In fact, it turns out after 10 moves, black's already better because of the pressure against the pawn on d4. And in the game after bishop e3, e5, d5, knight a5, this knight move might seem a little bit weird going to the edge of the board. The idea is if they move the bishop away that you do have this attack on the pawn that does kind of win you the pawn actually, because if they play bishop f3, you've kind of got moves like queen b4 just to really overwhelm white with the attack in the center. So white ends up playing queen e2, but that ends up being a bit of a mistake as well, because after this very nice move of b5, well done if you spotted it, it turns out white's going to lose the pawn regardless, because, well, if they try to defend the d5 pawn move like queen d3, the problem is black can just play knight takes g4 and use the pin here just to win a pawn. And in the subsequent play, maybe black should have just played knight e3 instead, and this might have been a more clinical way to play it. But in the game, knight f6 was played, and white tried to sort of swindle and get some counterplay in the center. But Tiviakov just did a very good job at neutralizing it, realizing that bishop f4 is just very well met by the move rook h4, which, is probably the move that Kamsky missed here. Because in the rising position, even though the material is equal for the moment, it's very clear that black is dominating. Like, black's piece is just a lot more active, and, white has some clear weaknesses that are not so easy to address. Now, in the game, bishop f d4 was played. We had f5, queen f3, and, Tiviakov decided just to give back the pawn. Technically, you could also have just played castles and just hung on to the extra pawns, but the way he played it does also keep a pretty big advantage in all fairness. After b4, black decided to, get his passed pawns rolling over here. And the subsequent game wasn't the cleanest, like white had sort of got back a little bit into the game because black probably should have played a move such as king f7 and, given back this pawn in order to just have a clear advantage in the endgame, where white's having a bit of a hard time to both defend the d pawn and deal with the passed f pawn. But the way the game played, white sort of could have escaped if they, had found this move of queen b3 and sort of going for the pin this way. Instead, after queen f3, black was kind of able to get things sort of back on track. And after rook e4, it's very clear black just has full control over the position. The game ultimately concluding like this, where now black is just keeping a very strong initiative. White doesn't really have a whole lot of counterplay. And after some more moves, black is able to liquidate the pieces, get his attack in with the move rook b2, and white just resigned in his position because of the extra material and the pins. So that was the second last game I wanted to share. The last one I wanted to share was a gameplay between Nidich against Tiviakov. This one featuring a little bit of a slightly curious move order by both sides, actually. Because rather than playing normal knight f6 in this game, Tiviakov played the c6 move order, which actually was the move order was my initial recommendation for black in the initial play to Strongest Scandinavian course, with the idea of kind of playing this creative bishop g4 move order as a way of trying to play the standard set while avoiding the annoying knight e5 move that we saw early on in the video. That being said, white does also have the option of bishop to c4, and there's a few ways in which you can play it. Like knight f6 in the game is perfectly fine, but there's also moves like bishop f5 and, playing it this way is possible too. Even bishop e6 actually is kind of an interesting move as well, where you sort of play to, just exchange the bishops and just get a very solid kind of position in that way. So that would also be quite decent if you want to play more creatively, but in the game, rather than playing knight f3 and allowing this kind of pin like we saw at the very start, white played a move knight e2 just to sort of neutralize this whole idea. And knight e2 is not such a bad move. It does have the idea of playing bishop f4 as well. Note, by the way, that in this position, if white had played knight e2, that it would give us that option again of playing b5 and just going for this kind of Miran style setup that is ultimately just going to be very, very healthy for black. But returning to the game, clearly that option's not available in this version, so bishop f5. I think here white maybe should have given some thought to playing a move like bishop f4, so I do think that in a position like this one, I do think white is a little bit better. I mean, it's not the end of the world for black, but I do think white has a little advantage after something like this, just because of, our queen having moved a lot of times. And it's probably going to end up moving a little bit more later on as well, so that's, kind of the reason why I slightly prefer white here, but in the game, white played a little bit differently, where they played the move of castles and kind of went for this knight g3 approach instead, which is also possible, but I think that it's not quite as efficient. So I just feel like you just have a very good version of a Caro-Kann, where white's pieces just are not so well placed in this kind of structure. If you want to try and justify it, like maybe you can go f4 and try to get an f5, but I think that in that case, a move like knight bishop f5 is a good reply, where you can just kind of shut down the attack and sort of have this good position where the white bishop is really stuck behind the pawns on c1 in a long term. So, and also a little trick I do want to share, you do also have this move of castles as well, where you can actually sacrifice the bishop, knowing that you're going to get it back anyway, and be fine in a position like this one, let's say. So yeah, that might be the worst case scenario for black, but after knight c2, now black is just very comfortable. Like I think even queen c7 and bishop d6 might have been a possible improvement, but also in the game this also proved to be quite fine for black. Black just got the pieces developed, and it just ends up being a fairly normal sort of middle game. H4 probably is a little bit too creative on white's part, let's say. You could play a move like h6 as well if you do want to still keep the option of castling short, because it's not like bishop e6 is going to be all that scary. We do have the move of g5 to kind of fight back and make it a bit messy. But anyway, in a game, black played the move long castles, which is maybe the more practical move and also going to be fine. Knight f8 just a very good defense just to attack the pawn, and it's a common problem for white in the Scandinavian to find a good way to defend that d4 pawn in the middle game. After h6 take, we see that black has the bishop pair. Although I do think maybe this is where the game loses some of its relevance, because I do think that black probably should have played gf6 instead and sort of had that dynamic play down the g file, as it were. Guess yeah, in the game, like white probably should have just taken the bishop and just said that they were slightly better in a position like this, with black's pieces still being just a little bit awkward in this kind of structure. But instead, after queen f3, what sort of ended up happening was white just kind of, well, I mean, like neither side played it in the very best way, let's put it like this. But in the end, black was sort of able to get in this bishop h4 trick that white had kind of underestimated, where black was able to go rook to f8 and sort of ultimately be kind of okay in this opposite colored bishop position. Where in the end, sort of the weakness of white's king kind of became a factor, where white didn't really protect his king properly, and black managed to grind out this equal position to a win by the very end of it. So yeah, that pretty much concludes the top 10 Scandinavian games of Sergei Tivyakov that I had actually picked out for a blog post a few years ago, but I wanted to share it here in a video form, just for the benefit of those who haven't seen the posts, and just to be able to see how the typical Scandinavian middle games play out by one of the biggest experts of this opening. So yeah, if you really enjoyed this video and you're sort of thinking that maybe the Scandinavian is an opening that you would like to start playing as your system against e4, then do make sure to check out Play the Strongest Scandinavian in 2025 in the description below. Just so you know, that it is the last 1 to 2 days of the launch before the price does go up. So do make sure to get in relatively quickly so that you don't miss out on that timeline, as it were. But yeah, I mean, you can feel, that the Scandinavian is like a really fun opening, just very easy to play it in a lot of different ways. Like you're often putting the pieces on the same squares in the opening. You're kind of getting very similar sort of positions in the middle game, and you're just going to be a lot more comfortable, like with this sort of structure than your opponents will in general. Just having a lot more knowledge and a lot more experience of the positions. So yeah, that's all for me from this video. I will be back tomorrow with another video. Not sure on the topic yet, but if you have some suggestions in the comments of what Scandinavian topics you'd like me to cover, do let me know. But yeah, that's all for this one, and I will see you in the next video. Take care.